I'm really happy today to be presenting on behalf of my co-authors. Unfortunately, Hannes couldn't join us, but Mons is here, and we're really happy to talk about this really interesting collaboration we've had, not just between law and statistics, but also with the Swedish National Crime Prevention Council, also known as BRUA, where we've been looking for an opportunity to explore how to use machine learning tools to improve hate crime classification in Sweden. Hate crimes are a really complicated area of the law, and there are two things that we're primarily interested in. There are two types of crimes specifically in Sweden that we're looking at. Some are specific hate crimes in and of themselves. So that might include things like incitement against an ethnic group or unlawful discrimination. And then there's also a penalty enhancement provision. So you can imagine if you have a traditional instance of graffiti, that might be prosecuted as vandalism. If that vandalism is a graffiti of a swastika, that might be an aggravated offence for a hate or a prejudice-motivated crime. The current processes of identifying these types of crimes are from the earliest version of a police report. When an officer is typing in their police report to the system, they get a pop-up box right at the end which says, please tick if you think that there might be a bias motivation, with a brief description of what that might look like. It probably is no surprise that there is a lot of inconsistency in the way that the police annotate those crimes. And this is a real concern for BRUA, who have to then take that information, conduct manual reviews of all of those police officers' reports to try and make decisions for themselves on how they can report on the number of hate crimes, the type of motivations that arise in these instances. And their statistics look at their subset of their review often relates in like a really, really low accuracy of about 50%, depending on the types of crimes that we're looking at. So there is a separate concurrent paper which is referenced in our work, which looks at the more statistical aspects of the estimation task and the model design, but we wanted to take this one step further and then evaluate where does the model succeed, where does it fail, what are the types of things we need to consider in the responsible development of this tool, either for a lower risk application in a statistical setting of the estimation of crimes. Also, what if it was to one day be rolled out at a case level? To do this, we compare the performance of a text classification model to the police annotations. Then we also compare whether there might be systematic biases. So we have access to things like crime code, which is the crime-specific instance, also what police region and what type of motivation arises. And we look at what some of the legal and ethical issues might be in a deployment like this. So thankfully, because of our collaboration with government, we have access to a huge amount of data, but it's very imbalanced. So we have all of the police reports from 2007 to 2022, and we have a very small subset, but very high quality subset of gold standard annotations from BRUA experts that give us an insight into what they would label whether or not that police report contains a bias or hate crime motive or not. And then when we are able to compare the differences between these two, we're looking for where there might be a disagreement between either BRUA, so the expert ground truth label, the police initial classification, and our model classification as well. So while we don't have time to get into all of the details, I've put out a couple of really interesting examples to show you the success and the failings of these models. So we're very thrilled to report that there is an extremely high improvement in accuracy and precision with our textual classification model compared to the police reports. On the gold standard annotation, we received a F1 score of over 90%. However, there are, of course, then instances of where this fails, and that's quite interesting from more of the legal and ethical perspective of what risks do we need to be mindful of. So one example of a false positive where the model overclassifies police reports, in particular, is a good example we've pulled out is reports about protests that involve the burning of the Quran. Now, many of you might also intuitively feel that that is something that you would flag as a hate crime, but this is where the legal context of Sweden is quite specific. So Sweden, being the first country in the world to implement free speech protections, has a very special standing for the free speech protections in Sweden, such that a burning of the Quran is not seen as a hate crime or an incitement against an ethnic group. It's seen as a free expression on the religion, not as an expression against the Muslim population as a group in itself. And that makes sense why a textual model might struggle to have that kind of nuanced classification in the same way that police often struggle with that classification issue as well. But when we have benefits from the legal expertise of somewhere like BRUA, we can make clearer assessments. An example of false negative is hate crimes against the Sami people, one of the indigenous populations of Sweden and other countries across Scandinavia and Russia. And we attribute that lower performance to a couple of reasons. One is just pure data sparsity, and there are two reasons for that. One, they are a minority group. There are just fewer hate crimes against the Sami people than other issues in Sweden. The second is also an internal issue. So anti-Sami hate wasn't labelled separately until 2014. Previously, it was just labelled as a form of xenophobia or racism. So with less data, the models performed worse. There's also an importance of the cultural nuances and the language specifics of certain hate crimes that are really hard to generalise in just these sort of textual models. An example of false negatives we found were the intentional targeting and killing of reindeer. That's something that can be really hard to pick up by comparison to something like references to symbols or racial slurs. But in Sweden, that's a specific commentary and a specific attack on the indigenous people's rights for reindeer herding. And that's like a very common sort of issue with these models is like the jurisdictional specific biases that we encounter. We also have a similar issue you can see on this graph of like transphobic crimes, which were also only more recently implemented into the law. So there's another data sparsity issue there as well. Across our systematic biases, we identified from the crime code. So a crime code is a very specific crime. It's not just vandalism, it's vandalism on public property or vandalism on private property. So we can get into like a lot of detail here. I mentioned that there are specific hate crimes. One of them is incitement against an ethnic group. So thankfully, that's the one that the police do best on, as we would expect. But we have really low police precision on things like assault and unlawful threats because it can be quite challenging to try and gather the intent behind some of those crimes. And while we're happy to not just see an improved model precision across all of the crime codes, also really nice to see a higher consistency across all of them as well. We notice that there is a distinction between the police regions in Sweden. This isn't just geographical region, but is also an administrative region. There are 5 different regions in Sweden. And we notice that there is a slightly lower precision in Stockholm, which makes sense when you consider the complexity and diversity of hate crimes that occur in urban regions by comparison to more regional areas, such as protests involving the Quran burning were all in Sweden from the ones we looked at. So the legal considerations and ethical issues that arise here really depend on the context of its deployment. We would consider a statistical estimation of hate crimes an excellent application of this tool. It's reasonably low risk, you're looking at aggregate data, and you're reporting directly into a government agency who is responsible for this information. But with such high accuracy, you can appreciate why there might be more police officers and police departments that are looking to use a tool like this to reduce the manual load and improve direct case level classification. That, however, is going to raise a lot more risks, and those risks are often quite dependent on the risk of a false positive or a false negative. False positives are going to come up against issues of the unjust impact on an accused person or wrongly accused of a hate crime motive, and it's also going to misdirect resources such as the special prosecutors units and so on. And likewise, for false negatives, are going to potentially deny justice to victims and then continue to perpetuate bias of hate crime motives that are missed continually. And so we'll go through some of the legal issues of these applications. We look at whether it would fall under a high-risk task under the EU AI Act. We look at what kind of transparency might be required, primarily for the issue of procedural rights. Because we're entering the space of the criminal justice system, we're very concerned about what the risk might be if you have an automation bias, whether you can ensure due process, how that might go on to affect the whole pipeline of the criminal proceeding that follows. And we also talk about a unique intersection of criminal and anti-discrimination law in Sweden, where we could see these types of systematic errors may breach principles of non-discrimination. So our key takeaways are that it's fantastic to have this improved accuracy, and we hope that a continual development and refinement of these tools has a positive effect on these types of processes. But it's extremely important to put your data in context. It's specifically important because of your jurisdictional biases and also the jurisdictional legal specifics, where some of those things that we just report as hate crimes in Sweden would not be hate crimes in other countries and vice versa. And to do that, we like to end with, we should always engage interdisciplinary domain expertise. We've benefited immensely from having a collaboration between law, statistics, and a government department, and that can really help bring together, hopefully, a very responsible implementation for machine learning, whether that goes forward or not. So thank you very much. Very happy to answer any questions.